Welcome. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at Java for loops. Let's get started. Today's only learning goal is that you can explain how for loops work and use them to solve problems. Just like a while loop, a for loop repeats a block of code while a Boolean expression is true. And in our example, you can see that Boolean expression that we're going to loop as long as the variable I is less than 10. But for loops also include a variable, in this case I, that is used to control the loop. When we want to write a for loop in Java, there are three things we need to provide in the loop parentheses. The first thing is we need to give Java a loop variable and a starting value. So in this case, we're creating a variable I and starting it at 0. The second thing is we need a while condition. This is a Boolean expression, and the loop will repeat as long as this Boolean expression is true. In this case, we'll loop as long as I is smaller than 5. Lastly, we need to define how the variable should change after each iteration. In this case, we want I to increase by 1. So let's walk through the loop and see what the output is. So initially I starts out at 0, and since 0 is less than 5, the loop will execute and it will print line I. I is 0, so we are just going to print line 0. Now that we're at the end of the loop, I will increase by 1 because that's what we told it to do. So I becomes a 1, and since 1 is still less than 5, the body of the loop will execute and we will print line the 1. Again, at the end of the loop, I increases and becomes a 2. 2 is still less than 5, so we print it, and I becomes a 3. 3 is still less than 5, so we print it, and I becomes a 4. 4 is still less than 5, so we print it, but this time things will be a little bit different. Here at the end of our loop, I will increase to 5, but 5 is no longer less than 5, it's equal to, so at this point, the loop ends with our output being the numbers 0 through 4. All three components of the for loop can be altered so that the loop can basically count any way you want. In this example, we start I at 100. We say we want I to loop as long as it is greater than or equal to 0, and instead of counting up by 1s, we count down by 2s. And so when we print, the first output is going to be 100, then 98, and so on and so forth, all the way down to and including 0. Before we wrap up for today, it's probably worth taking a couple of moments to compare and contrast for loops with the while loops that we learned in the previous lesson. So for a for loop, we're going to repeat code while some Boolean condition is true, and the same is true for while loops. So in that sense, they somewhat serve the same purpose, yet they do it in different ways. For loops include a variable in the loop header, where if you want a variable for your while loop, you're going to have to create that separately, which may or may not be a big issue. Generally speaking, for loops are helpful and can save you code in situations where you need to loop a specific number of times or through a specific number sequence, whereas while loops can be used in any situation. So for loops and while loops are two different tools that do roughly the same job, and which one you pick is going to depend on the situation and what might make the most sense to you. Here's a quick understanding check. The for loop you see on the screen prints some values to the screen, and I'd like to know what values it prints. Now you'll notice I was a little bit sneaky here because I didn't tell you before that for loops could actually have more than one variable. And so I've done that here and really just want to see if maybe you can figure it out. So pause the video, see if you can figure out what this for loop prints, and when you're done, resume and we'll chat about the answer. Let's walk through the loop step by step and see what we get. So this loop initializes two variables, I and j. I is set to 0, j is set to 5. And we're going to continue looping as long as I is less than j. And since 0 is less than 5, we will execute the body of the loop and print line I times j, which of course is 0 times 5, which will give us an output of 0. Now at this point, we've reached the end of the body of the loop, and so we're going to increment our variables. I is going to increase and j is going to decrease. So we end up with 1 and 4. And since I is still less than j, we will print line I times j. 1 times 4 is indeed 4. So now that we're at the end of our loop, I will increase, j will decrease. We now have 2 and 3, and I is still less than j, so we will print line I times j, which is 6, and then one last time change our variables. I will increase, j will decrease, which leaves us with 3 and 2. Now at this point, I is no longer less than j. The looping condition is false, so the loop ends with an output of 0, 4, and 6. Now that you've watched this lesson, you should be able to explain for loops and use them to solve problems.